Hello team, welcome to another ATPGEO politics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a UK political update, a special on the local elections. Now, these were local elections that took place in England only, not Scotland, not Wales, not Northern Ireland. And they only took place in certain councils, your sort of borough council election. I live in Fareham Borough Council, right? And I would have been voting for my councillors to run local services on a very localised level, right? This is not my general election, vote for a member of parliament to go to London and represent me. This is just local elections. And indeed, didn't take place in Fareham. We had ours last year, I believe, if I remember correctly. So this year, only so many local councils were up for grabs. Not that big a set of elections, but actually do give us a really important sense of what's going on nationally, because really, I think you're translating national sentiments onto local issues, and people aren't really voting for someone that's going to work hard to do things to do with, like, I don't know, local pathways and potholes or whatever. This is, I think, a reflection of national sentiments. But not that many local councils are up for grabs. There were some mayoral positions up for grabs. Some were newly created. Mayors are kind of relatively new for the UK. We've had them for a number of years in some major areas like Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester, sort of London mayor. That's a big thing. But actually, they are relatively new, but only in a certain number of big places. Now we're getting more and more of these regions of certainly England being divvied up and having a mayor. Right, so a couple of new mayoral positions were up for grabs, and then a number of pre-existing mayoral roles. But actually, the mayors have a particular job, but it isn't as far-reaching as some people think. And indeed, we've got evidence that even mayoral candidates didn't really understand their own role, because they were promising to do X, Y, and Z, and it wasn't even in their remit to do so, to be able to do so. But anyway, we'll come to that in a little bit. So let me just give you my baggage and my biases. So I didn't campaign. I debated publicly on behalf of Remain in the EU referendum back in 2016, 9 years ago. And reform is arguably an evolution of the Brexit results, well, the votes in 2016. Now, I debated publicly before Brexit and after Brexit, after that 2016 referendum. And I am basically pro-EU, but there is some nuance there. And I will try and discuss this as objectively as possible. But remember that Reform aren't naturally my kind of party. So I will probably be quite critical of them, but hopefully you'll see the basis of why I might be. And actually, I'm going to be a little bit critical of all the the two main parties and Reform, to kind of explain how Reform have been able to do so well in these local elections. So that's the bit of my own baggage, as I say. Now we need to explain what Reform UK are, and where they came from. They came from UKIP, UK Independence Party, who were basically your absolute, one-trick pony, Eurosceptic party that were trying to whip up a momentum to get people to vote to leave the EU. So they came predominantly from the right, from the Conservative Party, Eurosceptic kind of sector that was able to flourish after the election was called, the referendum was called by David Cameron. Now, remember, it was a non-binding referendum, but it was kind of treated as binding. It's like, whatever you decide, that's what we're going to do. But actually, there was no legal basis for that. But anyway, that's a whole other debate. So we had this referendum that David Cameron called because he thought it would just shut up the Eurosceptics in the party. But actually, it all went wrong. And the campaign was very badly run on the Remain side, I think. And Leave won. And it was largely a success of... I think what largely drove people to vote for Brexit was immigration. despite lots of people throwing in these veneers of other reasons, such as sovereignty and EU making our rules and we want to make them ourselves, when you'd actually look at the data of people's opinions, the electorate's opinions, sovereignty had never featured as an issue. No one was worried about sovereignty until about June 2016 when they were told to worry about sovereignty. So then they threw out on sovereignty on the top, but really what was driving it, I think, was immigration. And there was just, I think, quite a gross misunderstanding of what the EU did and how it was run. And I think that's because it's understandably incredibly complex. The EU is a very complex international kind of organization, and it was quite easy to generate actually a populist sentiment that these were kind of political elites making decisions undemocratically, not on our behalf, not with our best interests in the UK at heart, and so therefore we need to, it's us against them. And it was a in line with the MAGA movement in America at the time. So 2016, with Donald Trump coming on board, and he was actually supportive of Brexit too. You had this real fertile period for right wing populism to turn up, the kind of us against them, ordinary people against the elites. And I think Brexit was a really visceral manifestation of that. And it largely driven by immigration worries and free movement of people. And with that, I mean, the annoying thing about trying to understand how Brexit took place is that people's voting, the data is actually personal, private, right? So we don't 100% know who voted for Brexit, but what we can do is we can look at areas and say, well, this county voted whatever percent for leave and whatever percent for remain, and it turns out that this county has a particular education level that's here and has an immigration level that's there. In other words, there were some correlations that you can speculate were causal factors, right? Which were that, generally speaking, less educated areas voted Brexit, and areas with less immigration voted Brexit, and areas that more working class voted Brexit. Obviously, caveats apply, and not all the time, and some differences. But broadly speaking, you can see that there was a working class element to the Brexit vote. Now that then becomes interesting, and this is all important for where we're going here. Honestly, you need to understand this, because Labour didn't officially come out for or against the EU for Brexit, and the Conservatives didn't either. So they said, right, we're not going to tell you how to vote here. You guys go and vote, and that's because both parties realised that they had their electorate split, right? And so it's like, okay, we'll have individual MPs can campaign however they like, but there's no official party line. There's no party whips telling either MPs what they should do or the electorate what they should do. Now, Labour therefore didn't have a very clear vision of the EU and Brexit, because a lot of their working class left-wing Labour voters were actually very strong Leave supporters. Now, what that then meant is when the UKIP party, after Brexit took place and Leave was voted for, 52-48, UKIP became the Brexit Party. They kind of reformed into the Brexit Party, which then became Reform UK. Now, they all through that evolution, the parties understood that, politically speaking, their success came to some significant degree from a number of parties, from the kind of right-wing, conservative, probably more politically elite side of things, like the Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party, and also some of the working class in the Conservative parties. And I know people locally who are working class, Conservative through and through, voted Brexit, but also Labour working class people, and other people all around that. There's a whole spectrum of people voted for Brexit, but we're talking about like generalities here. And what that's meant is that Reform UK have understood that they can't just campaign on a typically right-wing populist platform. So yeah, it's going to be about immigration. It's going to be about some of these classic right-wing populist ideologies, but also they're taking along with them a number of left-wing working class voters who are going to be interested in, like, so for example, Reform UK just recently came out in favour of nationalisation of steel, right? That's quite a left-wing thing. They wouldn't have done that in the original iteration as UKIP. They just would not have supported that. But they understand in order to get into power, they need to appeal to elements of the left and elements of the right now. And really, they've got to harness a populism that sets, us against them of the political elite. And that goes a long way to explaining what's gone on here, which is the political elite are the duopoly of the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And so Reform have basically battered the existing political establishment of the Conservatives and Labour. And they're doing that largely still on immigration, interestingly. So, and I was listening to a Conservative MP yesterday admit this openly. He said, we had 14 years. So you had 14 years of the Conservatives. They failed through austerity. There's a lack of money. There wasn't investment in public services. There wasn't investment, I don't think, in generally in all sorts of things across the political land, the government landscape, and that allowed there to be quite a, not only do you get bored of the party that rules for 14 years, but when there's underinvestment, then people get annoyed that their services aren't operating properly. So the waiting lists for the NHS were through the roof, and so on and so forth. But also, and here's the interesting part, he said, look, one of our main things in the Conservative Party was immigration. That was what was largely behind Brexit. And what happened is you had a lot of people worried about the free movement of people during Brexit, and the not wanting lots of particularly Eastern Europeans to come and work in the UK. And so we wanted to get out of Europe so that we could close the borders. But what happened is that, economically speaking, you still needed those workers. And so you replaced white Europeans with brown Southeast Asian migrants. And that has been deeply ironic, right? So lots of people who are very concerned with immigration, to the point where they voted to leave the EU, are just as angry now that after 14 years of the Conservatives, migration levels are huge, right? And there are illegal migration crossings from across the channel, but also legal ones through family and work visas and student visas from people, particularly from Southeast Asia, so brown-skinned people, and that then riles up some of those, typically right-wing Conservative voters, but also oftentimes left-wing working class voters are not happy with that as well. And so the immigration sentiment is still something that drives reform, even though we're 9 years on from Brexit. So it wasn't solved by Brexit. And that's what we're seeing across Europe with AFD, with Rassemblement National, with Meloni's party, and the other parties that she's in coalition with, and a number of these places, Vox in Spain, and right around Europe. This is what is driving a lot of right-wing populism to gain more and more of attraction. And even when you look at left-wing populism like the BSW in Germany, I understand that they're fairly strong on immigration as well. So reform are able to generate or harness the discontent over immigration, but also over the lack of money, really, that is in the public coffers. From the Conservative 14 years of austerity after the 2008 financial crisis, their way of dealing with that was not to borrow and spend, but to cut. And this is that kind of Doge thing. The problem is, before it was Doge, right? The problem is you cut, you're not stimulating the economy, you're not promoting growth. And it's very difficult to get out of that cycle. And actually, I think history has shown us that austerity was the wrong approach. I mean, if anything, you want a bit of everything. So you want to borrow and spend and stimulate, whilst also cutting some of the fat around the edges. But if you go too deep, you are just going to move everyone onto unemployment, then have to pay them unemployment, and they're not able to spend. So, austerity really hurt the UK to the point that in 2024, Labour got in. And they're like, right, we want to do this, this, and this, but we didn't have a massive vision about where we could go, because we knew there was going to be no money, and we couldn't promise to do all these massive things. So they had very limited promises. And then they came in, found there was no money, and then continued. They skewed to the right to answer Reform's growing popularity, and also to keep the Conservatives at bay. They skewed to the right. So then they hit the welfare state. But the thing is, the welfare state also does need to be sorted out, because in the UK, after the pandemic, our welfare system bloated like everyone's did to support, everything that happened with the pandemic. But where the rest of Europe has broadly got that under wraps, the UK, weirdly, we've still got more people out of work from COVID related stuff than anywhere in Europe. Like there is a real issue in the UK. And so the Labour came in and said, right, we're going to look at winter fuel allowance for OAPs, for pensioners. We're going to look at disability benefits, and all these kind of really hot potato things that you like. Are you sure you want to do that? But I guess they were thinking it's the beginning of our tenure. We've got quite a lot of a mandate at the moment. If you want to do something unpopular, do it right at the beginning. So they were doing all that kind of stuff, but actually it's been seen as pretty unpopular, even though they've had some success with getting getting waiting times down for the NHS and all sorts of things where they could shout their successes. They're not very good at celebrating. Like, Trump should tell you, like, if you look at how Trump does things, what you should learn from that is that you need to go around shouting about how good you are all the time. Because if you do that, it oftentimes gets through and people believe you. I'm not saying lie, but when you do succeed, and this is what I think failed with the EU referendum, is that the Remain campaign didn't explain all the successes of the EU. They talked about immigration and they talked about the economy. They didn't say, look, we get this because of the EU. That got built because of the EU. We've had peace for this long because of the EU, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's going back 9 years. But just in general, you should be shouting about and communicating effectively about how well you've done in particular areas. And I don't think the Labour are very good at that. They've then skewed to the right. That has annoyed some people. But the irony is, those are also the people that were saying, well, that's what the Tories should have been doing. That's what Reform would do, which is, take a scalpel to the welfare system. Yet as soon as Labour do it, they're hit with a load of clubs. And they're possibly doing that to try and appeal to the very people that are hitting them with the clubs. And then you got the people on the left who are then genuinely annoyed at Labour doing that, and then they go to Lib Dems and Green. So Labour if you skew to the right, you're going to lose people to Lib Dems and Green, and if you skew to the left, you're going to lose those centrists to maybe Lib Dem and Conservatives. And then Reform are coming along as Populist, and as we know with Populists, they offer very simplistic solutions to very complex problems, like immigration, like the economy, like the welfare state. These are complex things, and they say, yeah, we're going to do this, do that, and do everything. Now, this is where it gets, and this is the heart of the analysis, and I know I haven't even gone through the stats yet. The better Reform do, and you can argue that part of the issue in Europe is that if you stop Rassemblement National in France and AfD in Germany from actually getting real tangible power, then you're never testing them for whether they're able to govern or not. And then they are just sitting on the sidelines, growing more and more popular and being frustrated by the elites, to the point where people react against that and saying, well, we're really pissed off that you're stopping AfD or RN or whoever from realizing their true potential and power, and that gives them even more popularity. At some point, you need to let them have some power, is one theory, so that they can be hoisted by their own petard, which is to say that they need to show that they're crap at governing, so that people go, right, no, actually, you are a bit rubbish. Oh, we're not going to vote for you again. Now, this has sort of happened. I think Reform have run one council before, and they bankrupted it. But I don't think it's well enough known, unless it was like when it was UKIP. But anyway, they don't have a good form for being actual serious governors. Now, what we're going to see is the more popular reform get, the more serious they're going to have to get about ruling. So what happens when you're a fringe opposition party is you can promise the world and not have to cost those promises or have serious policy nuance as to how that might work or what it would actually look like. You're going to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And you don't really care whether you can do that or not at all, because you're never really going to get in because you're a fringe opposition party. But as Reform have gone from a fringe opposition party to now a mainstream party and are now arguably the most popular party in the UK on present stats, they need to have costed serious policies, because otherwise you're just voting for them because they're not the other guys and you're so pissed off with the status quo. That could cause, they've got to fairly quickly come up with a serious a serious vision of what they stand for. Because I think, anti-immigration probably isn't going to do it. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in a second about what they might be standing for and how actually going forward that could be a problem. As you can see here, the Conservatives were absolutely shellacked. However, I think that's because predominantly the councils that are up for grabs were more conservative leaning councils anyway, in areas of the country that were more conservative. So had this been more of a case of being up north, if we look at some of the maps about where this took place, where's it gone? There were some maps. I don't know. There were some maps earlier. Let me find them. Yeah, here it is. So you can see that these councils are clustered in particular areas. These are Labour heartlands that you can see where I'm indicating here. There's a couple of Labour strongholds, and we'll look at that. And yeah, Labour, it can be quite big around here, but there are some Conservative areas that were possibly just more Conservative candidates that could lose than Labour candidates. So as the analysis here says, the Conservative losses were considerable across the board, especially as many of these council areas have been deeply Conservative for years. And that's the point. Labour were defending a limited number of seats in Starmer's first electoral test as Prime Minister, but their losses were proportionately significant. Okay, so the first thing to note is that Conservatives did get hammered, but essentially Labour got hammered too. If you understand the proportionality of how that worked. Now, my speculation, and I don't know this for sure, but my speculation is Labour would have lost some to Reform, some to Lib Dem, and some to Green. A Conservative would have lost more to Reform, with some to go into Lib Dem, possibly, because Lib Dem, I always say Lib Dem are the centre left for the middle class. So in very middle class areas, you will see Labour not featuring as much, but Lib Dems representing the left. And a good example of this is Cambridgeshire. So Cambridgeshire, think of Cambridge University. It's a real kind of middle class area, affluent area part of the country. And Labour aren't even on there. And you have Lib Dems increasing their vote share. So that's a reaction probably against Labour, but actually really against Conservatives. So Conservatives went down So the Conservatives went down 16.4% and Reform went up 16.4%. So Reform just stole the entirety of the Conservative vote there. And went down to 16.4%. So sorry. So they end up around the same place. So I think Reform really in these kind of middle class areas hit the Conservatives big time, and then some of the other left would have coalesced. So Labour would have coalesced whatever vote there was for Labour around the Lib Dems, and they would have done well. So they actually gain an overall control council. So where there wasn't any clear council majority for any party, the Lib Dems gained that. But when you look at other places like a proper Conservative area, Devon, actually that's a Lib Dem area, Devon, it used to be. But over time, it's actually Lib Dems are lost out when they went to coalition with the Tory government through Nick Clegg and David Cameron. The Lib Dems lost a lot of support in their heartlands, such as the west of the UK, down in Devon. But here we see Lib Dems going right back up to their former kind of glory, and the Conservatives getting absolutely hammered, Reform taking the vote from Conservatives there big time. But when you go to a Labour heartland, so one of these few places that was a big Labour place, County Durham, this shows you how much of a problem reform are for Labour. So Labour were massively, I mean, this is an absolutely staggering result. So Labour were hugely in in the majority here, and they have gone down to 4.1%. Reform went from essentially virtually zero to 66.3%. Lib Dems stayed the same. So Reform would have stolen both the entirety, I would have guessed, of the Conservative vote that was there, and then almost the entirety of the massive Labour majority. So when you go back to understanding these two bars here, you've got to understand that Labour, had they had more of their councils up for grabs, would have been hammered as equally as the Conservatives were. Reform are taking from both sides, which means I think that they are taking largely from the politically uninformed, so low propensity, low information voters, I would think. But also people, like I've heard so many people say, and this is one of my pet peeves, by the way, I've heard so many people say, I'm fed up, they're all the same. As if, like, there is no difference between Labour and Conservatives. Now, you could argue that actually Labour have skewed to the centre, and there is less of a difference between Labour and Conservatives than there ever was. But I think this is lazy political thinking. I really detest they're all the same. I don't like any of them. They're all liars. They're all cheats. I really don't like that. And I'm going to say that. And I know there are probably people watching this saying, that's what I think. They're all the same. All politicians are the same. I hear it from my in-laws, from my own parents, from this, all over. No, that's lazy thinking. No, they're not all the same. There are 5 different parties here, and they all have very, very different visions of what the country should be. Some of them maybe those visions aren't really strong enough. I'd argue Labour is like that. But, Greens, they've got a very strong vision of what the country should be like, and they've matured a lot over time. I would argue that Reform don't actually have that strong a vision of what the country's like, and they're a bit all over the place, and they've become a protest vote, and a protest for when people are thinking, I think, a little bit lazily. So with all of these councillors being voted for, you've had Reform gaining 10 whole councils where they're the majority in a council. So they're now going to have to come up with a sense of what their vision is for the country to then reflect that in the decisions being made in the council. I don't think, and one example of possibly a lack of vision is that there is someone that was voted for in one of the I can't remember what the council was. I don't think I've got it up here, whereby he hasn't turned up. Like, no one knows who he is, that he's not got a photo, an official photo. So people have ended up voting for this guy. No one knows, actually, no one has it appears that he might not even really exist. It might have just been a paper candidate. But people have voted for that person as a kind of a reaction against the duopoly, maybe, of Conservative Labour. It's just, they're all the same, I'm voting for this guy. Not really knowing what that guy stands for, who he is. But anyway, you've got 10 councils now under Reform control. You've got 3 councils go to no overall control. 3 councils go to the Lib Dems. Labour have lost 1 council, Durham, and the Conservatives got absolutely hammered with losing 15 councils. But that would have been the same for Labour had more Labour councils been up for grabs. So you can look at the swings here, but the end result is that predominantly Reform are smashing both Conservative and Labour. Look at Staffordshire, that's gone from a huge Conservative majority. So Stafford, quite well-to-do area, sort of Midlands, but more market towny. You got Shakespeare. Like Stratford upon Avon. Is that not Staffordshire? Anyway, you get the point. Conservatives previously held 90% of the seats, but after the election, Reform now held 80%, following a huge swing. That's absolutely insane. So the Conservatives have gone from 90% to 16.1%. Labour have dropped to 1.6%, but didn't have that much. But a lot of what they had went to Reform. Reform are now up to 79%. Just incredible. Lib Dems were able to secure substantial gains by capitalising on anti-conservative feeling, particularly in areas such as Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. So some of these kind of rural, somewhat affluent areas. Reform were called the wild card going into the election, and Farage's party surpassed expectations by claiming numerous control of numerous councils. The Greens, and this is something I want to talk about. The Greens, they were the councils up this year were not traditionally strong Green areas for the most part, but the party managed to pick up seats in a variety of councils, including in areas where they performed well in the 2024 general election. So one thing that you need to understand is that the Greens have been massively disadvantaged by the media that loves to talk about Reform. Reform have a huge messaging advantage. The Greens have more councillors than Reform. So although it says, in these areas, they went up 41 to 79, and Reform went up 648 to 677. But actually, nationally, Greens have more councillors than Reform. If the Green Party had the same coverage as Reform, it would have them winning in a landslide. So the Green Party have got 5 MPs. Reform had 5 MPs, went down to 4, now gone back up to 5. And you tell me, any channel that gives a Green Party as much coverage as Reform, there is none. Reform Party are massively advantaged by everyone talks about them all the time. No one talks about the Green Party, and yet they've got the same number of MPs and more local councillors than Reform. Tell me how that is fair. But of course, the Green Party would actually tax the billionaires, so they won't platform them. And here we see the Greens now have nearly 200 more councillors than Reform, 859 councillors on 170 councils in England and Wales, and yet they don't get a look in when it comes to messaging. It's all about Reform, so that's worth remembering. Now, just a few more points on the actual results. We've got Andrea Jenkins, who is a former politician, former MP for the Conservatives. I do not like her at all. She's now a Reform mayor. She got 42% of the vote in this new mayoral area, but otherwise Labour just about held on to most of their mayoral candidates or mayoral control, apart from in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, which is sort of middle class to a degree, and Peterborough just sort of going up north into the Midlands and up towards sort of Nottingham area. The Conservatives took that from Labour, but actually Reform took, I think, votes from both Labour and Conservative, but split them enough that Conservatives could get through there. We've got Luke Campbell, a former Olympic boxer, becoming the Reform mayor of Hull and East Yorkshire. We're going to talk about him in a second. So he that's a fairly convincing win there. And Labour just getting hammered elsewhere and only just winning in where else they were. Now, let's just look at a couple of councils here, and you'll get a sense of how big Reform are. So where it's like working class area like Doncaster, you've got Reform. Conservatives don't really feature. Labour getting absolutely hammered. They're down 29% and Reform are up 37%. So you can see they are taking Labour votes hugely where they are Labour places. What other one do we have? So we have here, Durham. That's the one I talked about earlier. Down 49%. Labour, Reform up 61. So you add Conservative and Labour and you get Reform. They are really really hammering at both parties there. In Kent, Conservatives totally replaced by Reform. And so Reform are just absolutely sweeping across the board. The only places where they struggle a little bit more or are not as successful is where you've got Lib Dem heartlands. So Oxfordshire, there's your kind of affluent area. Shropshire, less that Lib Dems did well there, taking from Conservatives the Lib Dems, while Reform also doing that and taking from Labour too. But you've got Lib Dems just holding on in some of these fairly affluent areas, or sometimes agricultural areas, or the West Country. Lib Dems doing okay. So but then interesting here, Now, this goes back to how much of this is to do with working classness and maybe education levels and so on and so forth. Now, Buckinghamshire is absolutely like affluent. This is Buckingham Palace, as in this is your heartland of the middle class here. What's happened? Well, the Conservatives got absolutely hammered, but they're down to 48% still, down 58% in Buckinghamshire. Lib Dems up 14% to 27%. Oh, sorry, 27. And then, Labour and Independents. But where's Reform? Reform up 2%. This should give you a very, very good indication that there are some interesting demographics to look at here. Why is it that Buckinghamshire didn't see Reform do well at all, as in compared to everywhere else? What is the difference between Doncaster and Buckinghamshire? And if you know Buckinghamshire, that is your absolute heart of affluence, I would argue. And I would also say that there's going to be, you can look at the socioeconomic status of people there. You can look at educational attainment there. You can look at maybe migration around there. All sorts of different things that might give you an indication. Be interesting what the migration stats are for Buckinghamshire, actually. But otherwise, Reform are just doing really well across the board. Now, the other interesting result is the only parliamentary result, and it was a win by 6 votes. 6 votes. So Runcorn and Helsby, and remember the word Runcorn because we'll look at that in a second. Runcorn and Helsby had a by-election for a member of parliament where the Labour Party went from 53%, 52.9% to 38.7%, and Reform went from 18% to 38.72%. Now, Reform took from Conservatives and from Labour. And again, they are taking from both. They are your protest votes. The question is, can they follow up these successes by building on that with and adding a sense of vision and a suite of policies that are going to appeal to Labour and Conservative voters alike? And that's where we're going to go now. So first of all, you've got Andrea Jenkyns as the new Greater Lincolnshire Mayor standing up and saying, well, we want to cut the council workforce by at least one council workforce in her area by up to 10%. The former Tory MP was asked how a Lincolnshire Doge, an equivalent to the Department of Government and Efficiency Unit, which is slashing US government spending under billionaire Elon Musk, would work. Asked how much money she would want to save, she said, so this is hard to answer this at this stage, but I think personally you ought to maybe look at cutting the workforce by up to 10%. We've got to have a lean, mean local government. That's why I personally like to see, but again, there are variables there because we haven't elected a Reform County Council leader yet, so there's got to be discussions. Jenkins said she's also up for a fight with the unions after the head of Unison urged council workers to sign up after Reform won control to several local authorities in Thursday's local elections. So this is where it gets funky, because Reform are typically your populist, but actually their heart is in the right wing. So Andrea Jenkyns is a former Conservative MP who will be anti-union. Now, if you are taking Labour voters, traditional Labour voters, as you can see from Durham, and you're taking them and you're bringing them over to Reform, and then you're going, and we need to get rid of union workers, and you're going to be anti-union, then you're going to lose those Labour voters back to Labour. Reform have a problem, and the problem is the tent that exists in the Reform camp, where you have Labour and Conservative voters being attracted to Reform. And Labour and Conservative voters do not believe the same things about how the UK should look. And if you've got a working class union voter that's gone to Reform because they don't like immigration and they don't like this, they don't like that, they don't like the Labour government, and they're pissed off with they don't like the Tory government for the last 14 years, and they're pissed off with how Labour have gone and immigration hasn't been controlled, then you need to understand that they are now part of your core electorate. So when you're going to then start a fight with unions, that could be controversial. Then we hear Nigel Farage. Literally, this is what he said as the leader straight after the Durham success, where the Labour vote got absolutely shellacked.
Stick to our principles. And I would advise anybody who's working for Durham County Council on climate change initiatives or diversity, equity and inclusion or anything, or things they can go on working from home, I think you all better really be seeking alternative careers very, very quickly.
Yeah, but just up there, you were talking about people don't work from home, you don't like diversity on the councils. A lot of people won't like that.
What you're missing is that is the centre ground of public opinion. There's a silent majority that believes in the things that we believe in. Westminster, and dare I say it, much of the media is out of touch with where this country is moving. And I think that's what today's election results prove. Nobody listens from this.
So the problem with what he's saying is that this is being driven by his narrative. And that narrative is actually not necessarily true. There's this culture war that's going on, but it's been a generated culture war that doesn't reflect that much of the reality in the UK. Here we've got him again saying the similar.
Going to be quite radical. Work from home, forget it. If you're a DEI officer, I suggest you look for another job. So things are going to be different. We can't wave magic wands. We don't pretend to, but it'll be a very different approach.
But DEI is not really, it's an American term. That is not really something that is on our radar as much as in the US. This is Trumpism. This is MAGA American Republicanism that has been imported into the UK as a kind of falsely created culture war. And I think it's a problem. You've got Reform Councillor John Doddy.
We give a fresh face, we give a new look to that, and we give a new way of actually delivering efficiencies. You call it Doge, we're going to just call it...
I didn't call it Doge. Nigel Farage called it Doge. Your party leader did.
Yes, he called it a Doge-style efficiency, but not in the same sense that you would think of Elon Musk, in the sense that it's a redistribution and more economic use of the resources that the hard-working people of Nottinghamshire have given us. They give us their tax money and we promise to do something for them in return for that. And what I'm saying is that we can do it better.
Are you worried about the responsibility that you now have? Because you're not just the party of opposition, you're not just the party of change.
Yes.
You will be the party that will be held to account for what you do or do not deliver here.
Yes, I'm excited by it. Give a fresh...
And that question is brilliant, because that's exactly right. Like, yeah, you can talk about Doge and making swinging cuts, but if you're now going to be the party in charge of doing that, and you're going to be held to account for that, are you worried about that? And actually, what is your vision? Now, this is where it gets, like, goes to what I was just talking about, that actually this kind of DEI situation isn't a fair reflection of how things operate in the UK, or indeed what these mayors can do. So the new Reform Mayor, Andrea Jenkins, a woman I was just talking about, vows to sack County Council's diversity officers, says the Independent, except there aren't any. Dame Andrea Jenkins has doubled down on Farage's pledge to sack diversity officers in Lincolnshire, but the County Council has revealed it doesn't employ any. And then here we have Nigel Farage says any Durham County Council staff working on diversity or climate change initiatives or think they can go on working from home should be seeking alternative careers, as you heard. Andy Fitchett here says councillors do not have the authority to fire council staff or set terms of employment. Reform councils are going to be a shit show. Councillors set strategy, finance and policy. Staffing decisions are made by the CEO, heads of departments and HR, over which the councillors have no say. It's really, really important. Indeed, you've got Luke Campbell, who's this boxer turned elected mayor of Hull and East Yorkshire, saying before he's elected, I will not increase your taxes. That's my pledge. No council tax levy, no business rates levy, no new taxes. No matter who wins, I challenge every candidate to match this pledge. If they don't, you know taxes are coming. This is so amateur. Like, this is unbelievably ridiculous. So as someone points out, about to be announced as your new mayor, he doesn't even know that a mayor doesn't set taxes. God help us. And as the community note says, this is factually incorrect. He does not have the authority to make these guarantees. The elected mayor does not have the autonomy to set the finance budget and taxes. That's a function of the full council. So, although you could argue he might be trying to pull them in that direction, like, he can't make those pledges. So the fact that he was running to be mayor and got elected in to be mayor when he was promising stuff to the electorate that he literally functionally cannot achieve is mind-blowing. Now, to go back to that Runcorn, the MP that's been elected in for reform, to take them back from 4 to 5 MPs, because Rupert Lowe that is just going through a court case with reform, so he's been kicked out reform, so it went from 5 to 4. They're going to go back up to 5. This is the Daily Telegraph, so this is a conservative newspaper running their famous Mac cartoon. Runcorn, so the MP, reform won here. They've already imposed tariffs on other counties and given Manchester to Putin. Talking about how reform are just, Farage is just a mini Trump. He's trying to bring Trump MAGA Republicanism into mainstream UK political talk, conversation, but also policy making. And the idea that, oh, right, now we've got a Runcorn reform MP, right, we're going to give Manchester to Putin, which is the idea that Trump's on Putin's side with the Ukraine war, but also that they're just going to impose tariffs on all these other counties like Trump has done. In other words, this cartoon is saying this is MAGA Republicanism in its UK form. That is what reform is. And reform are going to have to do better than that, better than just trying to import Doge and swinging cuts to local councils that they're in charge of to then screw over services. I mean, the thing is, much of the reaction here to Labour and Conservatives, why people have gone to reform is because the local services and national services have not been up to scratch. So if you're going to come in and say, yeah, you're really angry that stuff isn't getting done in your local council because there's no money there. Okay, well, what we're going to do is cut even more services. Now, I know, there is no money. So there are serious conversations about cuts. But if you're going to take on board what's happening in the United States with Doge and kind of use that as a blueprint, I know you other guys say we're going to take Doge but do it better. But essentially, reform are in danger of actually doing the very thing that they've been angry about the Conservatives and Labour for doing. And I think that comes from the position of them just being a protest vote. So I think Nigel Farage needs to be careful not to overstretch things. He's already talking in real MAGA language about culture wars and this and that. But I don't know that he's got the backing of all of his voters. Now, there will be some who will be very probably internet savvy on there who are just drawn into these culture wars fights. And you do get that an awful lot. So there will be a lot of those voters who will be aligned with that thinking, but there also will be a lot of those voters who won't be aligned with that thinking. And they've got such a broad church now that reform are in danger of not being able to cater for all of those different voters, and especially when they don't have a vision. I think Labour need a vision, and they need to go strong on some of their maybe more traditional convictions, and take back some of those Labour voters. I think they probably need to concentrate a lot on doing some really big things, concentrate on a couple of really massive national projects, and just back that to the hilt. Conservatives are all over the shop. They've got Kenny Badenoch as their leader, who has been fighting with Robert Jenrick to become leader, but Robert Jenrick wants Conservatives to merge with Reform, and Kenny Badenoch is under pressure. She's under pressure to step down already because they've been hammered. But they are going through this identity crisis like the GOP in America is, whereby, well, do we form a new party or do we just get subsumed by MAGA? And at the moment, the GOP is being subsumed by MAGA, so it's just becoming MAGA. Now, the Conservatives are going to have to say, well, do we merge with Reform? In other words, do we just become MAGA? Or do we separate and say, no, we are going to be a centre-right traditional Conservative party, as in small c Conservative, as the big C Conservative party. But we need to concentrate on conservatism as opposed to populism. And that populism at the moment is taking elements from everywhere that might not appeal or shouldn't appeal, actually, to a lot of traditional Conservative voters. So you've got a really interesting scenario here where the right is finally split, the left is split, and actually we need, I think, some kind of proportional representation to get a better, I think, representation of the electorate. At the moment, first past the post, it would be funny if first past the post comes out and bites Reform, and works in Reform's favour, because they are going to be campaigning against first past the post, because traditionally it has not been in their favour as a smaller party. But if they become a bigger party, they can end up benefiting from it, and then you'll end up seeing them campaign not for reform of the electoral process. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. That's my analysis of what's going on. I think this is very bad news for Labour, very bad news for Conservatives, and both parties are going to have to come up with a sense of what to do. Now, isn't it interesting that at the top of this Guardian live blog, they say Labour targets international students claiming asylum. That sounds very much like a Reform thing. So that's where they're at the moment, which is trying to appease the right in the country. But some would say, just don't do that. Just concentrate on your core base. A newly elected Reform councillor has said she's been suspended by the party over posts where she hinted she could defect to another party. So there you go. Already some issues going there. Andrea Jenkins, I did see some of her speech, and it was terrible, by the way. It was terrible. Gave the most graceless, clunky acceptance speech. It was a bad acceptance speech. But nonetheless, this Reform are a big problem for the Conservatives, and they're a big problem for Labour. Streeting, so he's the Health Secretary or the Minister for Health for Health Secretary, for the Labour government, says Reform are a real threat and may become Labour's main rivals. Absolutely they will. Especially if the Conservatives decide, as I think they should do, to steer away from Reform. If the Conservatives are concentrating only on power for the sake of power, not for the sake of, they're not focusing on what they really truly ideologically believe. If they just want power, they will merge with Reform to unify the right again. But that will be giving up on a lot of traditional Conservative ideals. So we'll keep an eye on how that evolves. And if the Conservative Party do decide to stay as the old school Conservative Party, then Reform will probably become the main rivals to Labour, and in fact will become more popular than Labour, unless there gets to be a realisation of who Reform really are, or the difficulty Reform will have of presenting a unified message and a unified vision. And if they in all of these councils that they control now start performing badly because they're not really used to governing, and they're broadly speaking not fit for purpose, maybe, then that could end up coming to bite them on the backside. If these kind of people end up cocking up the running of these councils, then they will be held to account, and Reform might find it more difficult to maintain their momentum as which is broadly based on them being an opposition party, because they're moving from being an opposition party into being, at least on a local level, a ruling party. And if it doesn't work out for them, they will be stung by that. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Let me know what you think and whether I'm, anywhere near accurate in what I am claiming. Whether you disagree, please do it with respect, and let's have a conversation. Toodle pips.